Charleston's auction records from the late 1840s contain an anomaly that slave traders refused to discuss publicly. A young woman registered only as Lot 47, female, approximate age 19, mute, was sold 17 times across 4 years. Each transaction occurred within days of the previous purchase. The pattern was unprecedented. Wealthy planters who'd paid premium prices would return her to market, often at significant financial loss, refusing to explain their urgency to be rid of her. 3 of these men abandoned their plantations entirely within months of the purchase. 2 others died under circumstances their families worked to keep from public record. The auction house finally burned the woman's documentation in 1851, claiming the papers were corrupted by water damage, though Charleston experienced no floods that year. What happened during those nights that made men of wealth and power willing to lose everything rather than keep one silent woman under their roofs? Before we continue with the story of Lot 47, if you're fascinated by the darkest corners of American history, subscribe to Circle of Fear 1 and hit that notification bell and tell us in the comments, what state or city are you listening from? We love knowing where our audience discovers these forgotten mysteries. Now, let's uncover what really happened in those plantation houses along the Ashley River. The truth began not in Charleston's grand auction houses, but in the aftermath of a tragedy that left questions no one wanted to answer. Charleston in 1847 stood as the wealthiest city in the South, its prosperity built entirely on rice, cotton, and the labor of enslaved people who outnumbered free whites nearly 2 to 1. The city's elite, families whose names appeared on bank charters and shipping manifests, competed not just in acres owned, but in the visible markers of refinement. A well-trained house servant reflected directly on a master's status. Women who could perform delicate tasks, who moved silently through rooms, who understood orders without speaking. These commanded the highest prices at Ryan's Mart and other auction venues lining Charmer Street. The low country plantations surrounding Charleston existed as their own insular world. Accessible primarily by river, these estates sprawled across thousands of acres of reclaimed swampland. Their big houses, rising on brick foundations to escape the humidity that rotted everything it touched. Mosquitoes bred in standing water. Yellow fever arrived with predictable cruelty each summer. The social fabric depended entirely on maintaining rigid hierarchies. Any disruption to the established order sent ripples of anxiety through communities that lived in constant unspoken fear of the people they enslaved. Into this world in March 1847 came a woman whose origins remained deliberately obscured. The bill of sale identified her only as property from a deceased estate in Beaufort County, approximately 19 years of age, described as comely, healthy, unable to speak, skilled in needlework and chamber service. No family name, no history, no explanation for how a young woman trained for house service. Education that took years and significant investment had ended up in an estate sale with such minimal documentation. The auctioneer, a man named Virgil Hask, who'd conducted sales for 2 decades, later told his brother, in a conversation recorded in private correspondence, now held by the Charleston Historical Society, that the woman's paperwork felt wrong. The handwriting changed mid-document. Dates were smudged. The signature of the estate executive was a label, but the woman herself appeared exactly as described, young, well-formed, with the kind of refined bearing that suggested careful training. She stood on the auction block without expression, her eyes fixed on some distant point, while Hask forbids. Richard Gillard made the winning offer. He paid 240 tons, a sum that raised eyebrows even among Charleston's elite. Gillard owned Fairweather Plantation, 3,000 acres along the Ashley River, and had recently lost his wife to complications from childbirth. He had 2 daughters, ages 7 and 9, and needed reliable household help. He'd specifically requested a woman who wouldn't gossip or carry tales between the big house and the quarters. A mute servant seemed ideal. The woman rode to Fairweather in the back of Goulard's wagon, her few belongings in a cloth bundle. She was installed in a small room off the main kitchen, given a pallet and blankets, and assigned duties that included mending, light cleaning, and attending to the motherless girls. The plantation's other enslaved people, 43 souls working the rice fields and maintaining the house, were told to help her adjust. But something was immediately apparent to those who shared living quarters with her. The woman never slept, or rather, she appeared to sleep, lying still on her pallet, eyes closed, but anyone passing her room could hear she was awake. Her breathing never deepened, her body never relaxed into genuine rest, and occasionally, in the hours after midnight, those with rooms nearby reported hearing a sound like humming. Not words, not quite music, just a low, sustained tone that seemed to vibrate in the chest. On the third night of her residence at Fairweather, Richard Gillard's oldest daughter, Catherine, woke to find the mute woman standing beside her bed. The girl later described the encounter to her aunt, testimony preserved in family letters with a clarity that suggests genuine terror. The woman stood perfectly motionless in the darkness, close enough that Catherine could feel her breath. When Catherine screamed, the woman didn't move, didn't startle, simply remained standing there until Gaillard burst into the room with a candle. Gaillard dismissed it as confusion. The woman was new. Perhaps she'd mistaken the room, but the next night, he woke to find her standing at the foot of his own bed. The house was locked. She had no reason to be in the family quarters. When he demanded an explanation, she, of course, couldn't provide one. She simply stood there, her eyes reflecting candle light, until he ordered her back to her room. The following morning, Gillard rode to Charleston and returned the woman to Ryan's Mart. He refused to discuss the matter publicly, citing only that she was unsuitable for his household needs. He accepted a loss of $300 on the resale rather than keep her another night. The second buyer was a widower named Thomas Porcher, who owned a smaller plantation near Goose Creek. Porcher had a reputation for harsh discipline and believed Gaillard had simply been too soft. He paid $950 and took the woman home with explicit instructions to his overseer. She was to remain in the quarters, perform field work, and not enter the main house under any circumstances. This lasted exactly 4 days. On the 5th morning, Porcher's cook, a woman named Dinah who'd served the family for 20 years, found the master in his study. He was sitting in his chair, awake but unresponsive, his eyes fixed on the window. Dinah later testified to the parish priest that Porch had the look of a man who'd seen his own death. When Dinah finally roused him, Porcher's first words were, "Get her off my land." The mute woman had never entered the house. She'd remained in the quarters as instructed, but Porch insisted she leave immediately. He wouldn't say what had happened. He refused to discuss it with his overseer, his neighbors, or the slave traders. He simply wanted her gone, and he wanted it done that day. Back to Charleston, she went, the third sale. Now the pattern began attracting attention among the trading community. Virgil Hask noted in his ledger, a detail preserved because the ledger survived a later fire, that rumors circulate regarding Lot 47. The price dropped to $720. The buyer was a plantation owner from Edisto Island named Marcus Brevard, a man known for his rational temperament and his detailed record-keeping. Brevard documented everything about his properties from weather patterns to crop yields to the health and behavior of every person he enslaved. Brevard kept the woman for 9 days, longer than either previous owner. His journal entries from this period were later obtained by his great-granddaughter, who donated them to a university archive in the 1920s, where they remained unexamined until a graduate student discovered them in 1963. The entries are chilling in their clinical detail. Day 1, the woman appears competent. She completed assigned tasks without instruction. She maintains disturbing eye contact. Day 3, she has not spoken as expected, but I observe her lips moving when she believes herself unobserved. No sound emerges. I cannot determine what she attempts to communicate. Day 5. I woke at 3:00 to find my bedroom door standing open. I distinctly remember securing it. The woman was discovered in the hallway outside. She offered no explanation for her presence. I have ordered she be confined to the quarters after dark. Day 7. Confinement has proven impossible. She was found this morning standing outside my bedroom window. We are on the 2nd floor. There is no ladder, no logical means of ascent. My overseer suggests she climbed the downspout, but I examined it. It would not support her weight. Day 9. I cannot continue this. Something is deeply wrong. She has done nothing overtly threatening. Yet I find myself unable to sleep, unable to think clearly. My hands shake. I see her face when I close my eyes. I will return her to Charleston tomorrow. The journal includes one final entry about the woman written 3 weeks after her departure. I learned today that Thomas Porch has died. They say it was his heart. His family found him in his study in his chair with an expression that disturbed even the undertaker. I think of the woman constantly. I wonder how many more will buy her before they understand. The slave trading community in Charleston was relatively small, perhaps 24 men who controlled the major auction houses and private sales. Information spread quickly among them. By the time of the 4th sale in late summer 1847, every trader knew about Lot 47. Some refused to handle her sale. Others saw an opportunity. The price continued to drop. $580, then $450, then $330, less than a quarter of Gaillard's original investment. The buyers changed too. No longer wealthy planters with household needs, but speculators looking for bargains, men who thought they could break her behavior through harsher treatment, or desperate owners seeking cheap labor for dangerous work. A lumber mill operator bought her for $330 and put her to work feeding logs. She performed adequately during daylight hours, but on the 3rd night, a fire started in the mill's main building. The operator accused her of starting it, though no evidence supported this. She'd been locked in the workers' quarters all night. Multiple witnesses confirmed it, yet the operator insisted she was somehow responsible. He sold her within the week. A rice plantation owner near Georgetown took her for $280, intending to use her in the fields where her inability to speak wouldn't matter. He kept her for 12 days. His overseer's report, preserved in plantation records, notes that she worked efficiently, but that other enslaved workers refused to sleep near her. They claimed she wasn't right, that she watched people while they slept, that the air felt heavy when she was present. On the 13th day, the plantation owner's son, a boy of 14, went missing. The entire plantation searched for 3 days. They found the boy in the swamp, alive but severely dehydrated, insisting he'd followed the woman who couldn't talk into the marsh because she'd seemed to be calling him somehow. The boy couldn't explain what he meant by calling when she made no sound. He simply knew he had to follow her. The plantation owner returned her to market immediately. 17 sales across 4 years, each buyer paying less than the last, each keeping her for shorter periods. The documentation became increasingly irregular. Some sales weren't properly recorded at all. Names were omitted. Dates were estimated. It was as if the trading community wanted to erase any proof she'd existed, but people remembered. Stories spread beyond the trading houses. In the taverns along East Bay Street, planters shared rumors over whiskey. The woman who made men abandon their homes, the mute woman who drove strong men to fear. Some claimed she was cursed. Others suggested she'd been a witness to terrible crimes and had been struck mute by what she'd seen. A few whispered that she was something else entirely, something that only appeared to be a woman. Haskett, the original auctioneer, became obsessed with understanding what was happening. He began tracking down previous buyers, conducting quiet interviews, piecing together a chronology. His notes, found among his effects after his death in 1856, suggest he believed the woman was somehow aware of men's hidden crimes, that she drove them to confession through her mere presence. He wrote, "Every man who has purchased her has carried secrets, dark ones, the kind that poison a man's sleep. She seems to sense this, to draw it out of them without words." But this theory couldn't explain everything. Some of the buyers appeared to be ordinary men, no worse than the society they lived in. Yet, they too became desperate to be rid of her. By 1850, the woman had been sold 14 times. She'd lived in more than a dozen plantations across the low country. She'd been assigned every possible type of work: house service, field labor, laundry, cooking, childcare, mill work. Nothing changed the pattern. Purchase, brief period of apparent normalcy, growing unease, desperate resale. The 15th buyer was different. His name was Nathaniel Harrington, and he owned a medium-sized plantation near Jacksonboro. Harrington had a reputation as a fair master by the standards of the time. He didn't separate families. He allowed enslaved people small garden plots. He rarely used the whip. He was also a meticulous record-keeper and an amateur naturalist who corresponded with scholars in Charleston about soil composition, bird migration, and weather patterns. Harrington approached the purchase scientifically. He'd heard all the stories, and he didn't believe in curses or supernatural explanations. He theorized that the woman had some form of mental affliction that manifested in disturbing behavior, perhaps a type of sleepwalking or seizures that occurred at night. He believed that with careful observation and proper documentation, he could identify the problem and either correct it or at least understand it well enough to manage her employment successfully. He paid $180, a price so low it suggested no one else wanted her, and brought her to his plantation in November 1850. He assigned her to work in the household, gave her a private room, and instructed his wife Margaret to treat her kindly, but to observe everything she did. Harrington kept detailed daily journals. These journals survived because his family donated them to a historical society in the 1930s. They provide the most comprehensive account of what it was like to live with the woman. Harrington's journals from the first week are almost boring in their mundane detail. The woman performed household tasks competently. She understood instructions given through gestures. She ate normal portions at meal times. She showed no signs of distress or unusual behavior during daylight hours. Margaret Harrington reported that the woman was actually pleasant company in a strange way. Her silence was restful rather than unsettling. But the nighttime entries tell a different story. Night 1, I woke at 2:00 to the sound of humming. Very low frequency, almost below the threshold of hearing, like a vibration more than a sound. I traced it to the woman's room. She appeared to be asleep, but the sound was emanating from her. I observed for several minutes. Her lips weren't moving. The sound seemed to come from deeper in her chest. When I touched her shoulder to wake her, the sound stopped instantly. She opened her eyes, but showed no surprise of my presence, just looked at me with complete calm. I returned to bed, but couldn't sleep. Night 3, Margaret woke me at midnight, terrified. She said someone was in our room. I lit a candle and found the woman standing near our wardrobe, just standing there. When I asked what she was doing, she of course couldn't answer. I led her back to her room, and this time I locked her door from the outside. The lock was still secure in the morning, yet I found her in the kitchen before dawn preparing breakfast as if nothing had happened. Night 5, I cannot explain how she escapes a locked room. I've examined the door, the windows, the floorboards. There is no secret passage, no loose boards, no possible exit except through the door I personally secured. Yet she appears wherever she chooses. Tonight I found her in my study. She was standing in front of my bookshelf, her hand on a specific journal, my private journal from 1843, the year I made certain decisions regarding the sale of a family. I never recorded those decisions anywhere. No one knows about them except the men directly involved, and they're all dead now. How could she know to touch that specific journal? Night 7. I am beginning to understand what the previous owners experienced. It's not that she does anything overtly threatening. She never speaks, never acts violently, never even appears angry. But her presence at night creates a feeling of exposure, as if she can see through walls. Through time, through the careful lies we tell ourselves about who we are. I find myself thinking about things I haven't thought about in years, decisions I made, things I witnessed and did nothing to stop, compromises I accepted as necessary. Her silence feels accusatory, though she makes no accusations. Night 10. Margaret begged me to sell her today, not because the woman has done anything to Margaret. She's been nothing but helpful during the day, but Margaret can't sleep. None of us can sleep. The house feels wrong at night. Heavy, oppressive. I wake constantly with the certainty that someone is watching me. And when I light a candle, sometimes she's there, sometimes she isn't. The uncertainty is worse than her actual presence. Night 12. I must be rational about this. I'm an educated man. I don't believe in hauntings or curses or any supernatural explanation. Yet, I cannot explain what is happening in purely material terms. How does she leave locked rooms? Why does her presence cause such psychological distress? Why does every man who buys her become obsessed with his own past actions? I spoke yesterday with Samuel Thornton, one of the previous owners. He admitted that during the week he kept her, he became convinced she knew about his first wife's death. The official story was fever, but Thornton's doctor had prescribed laudanum for the wife's nerves, and Thornton had increased the dosage without consulting the physician. The wife died of respiratory failure. Thornton was never questioned, but he said that when the mute woman looked at him, he felt certain she knew that she was waiting for him to confess. Night 14. Last night, I dreamed about the family I sold in 1,843. I separated the mother from her children because a buyer offered premium price for the children alone. The mother begged me, offered me anything. I refused because the profit was substantial. I haven't thought about this in 7 years. I've convinced myself it was just business. That's what we tell ourselves, isn't it? That it's just business, just economics, just the way things are. But last night, I dreamed of the mother's face, and when I woke, the mute woman was standing at the foot of my bed. Her expression hadn't changed. She wasn't accusing me. She wasn't doing anything except standing there. But I felt my heart breaking. I felt genuine anguish for the first time since 1,843. As if her presence was forcing me to feel what I'd successfully avoided feeling. I wept, God help me. I wept like a child while she stood there watching me with those calm, unchanging eyes. Night 15. I took her back to Charleston today. I couldn't keep her another night, but I didn't return her to the traders. Instead, I went to the church. I spoke with Father Ali. I told him everything about the woman, about the pattern of sales, about my own experiences. I confessed things I've never told another living soul. Father Ali listened. He said something I cannot stop thinking about. Perhaps God has sent you a mirror. Perhaps she reflects back what you carry inside. The question is whether you're brave enough to look. Harrington's journal ends there. There are no more entries about the woman, but church records from St. Michael's in Charleston show that Nathaniel Harrington made a substantial donation to the church in December 1,850, along with a written statement freeing 3 families he'd held in slavery, a total of 11 people. He also made provisions in his will to free the remainder of his enslaved population upon his death, which occurred in 1,859. The mute woman was not among those freed. She'd already been sold again. If you're gripped by this story and want to know what happened next, hit that like button, share this with someone who loves dark historical mysteries, and subscribe so you never miss content like this, because what comes next will change everything we thought we knew about Lot 47. The 16th buyer was a man named Cornelius Gage. He paid $125. By now, the woman was selling for less than the cost of a plow horse. Gage owned a small rice plantation near the Kauai River, isolated enough that he rarely saw neighbors. He was known as a hard man who'd built his modest wealth through ruthless efficiency, and who had no patience for what he called superstitious nonsense. Gage thought the previous owners were weak. He believed the woman's behavior, whatever it actually consisted of, could be controlled through discipline and isolation. He put her to work in the rice fields during the day and locked her in a rice barn at night, separate from all other buildings. He told his overseer that if she somehow escaped, she was to be whipped and confined in stocks. She never tried to escape, but within 3 days, Gage's entire rice crop began failing. The seedlings withered, the dikes leaked, equipment broke. 3 workers suffered injuries in separate accidents. Gage's overseer, a man named Thaddeus Cooper, who'd worked rice plantations for 15 years, told Gage the plantation was cursed and that they needed to get rid of the woman immediately. Gage refused. He was not a man who backed down. He kept the woman for 3 weeks, longer than most recent owners. During this time, according to Cooper's later testimony recorded when Cooper sought employment elsewhere and had to explain his abrupt departure from Gage's plantation, Gage began to deteriorate. He stopped sleeping, started talking to himself, would stand in his fields at night, staring at the barn where the woman was locked, as if expecting something to emerge. On the 21st night, Gage went to the barn himself. Cooper watched from a distance, concerned for his employer's state of mind. Gage unlocked the barn, entered, and remained inside for what Cooper estimated was close to 2 hours. When Gage emerged, he was changed. Cooper described him as broken, like a man who'd been forced to watch his own soul laid bare. The next morning, Gage freed every person he enslaved, all 47 of them. He gave them papers, supplies, and what money he could spare. He told Cooper the plantation was finished and that Cooper should find other employment. Then Gage took the mute woman to Charleston himself. But this time, he didn't take her to the traders. He took her to the port, to a ship captain named William Drexel, who regularly sailed to the Caribbean islands. What Gage paid Drexel, or what agreement they reached, was never recorded. But the woman left Charleston on Drexel's ship, the Meridian, bound for Nassau in the Bahamas. This should have been the end of the story, but it wasn't. 6 weeks later, Drexel returned to Charleston. He arrived at night, which was unusual. He went directly to Virgil Haskett's home and demanded to see him immediately. Haskett's wife later told her sister in a letter that survived in family papers that Drexel looked like a man pursued by death itself. What Drexel told Haske became the subject of whispered conversations among the trading community. The accounts vary in details, but the core story remains consistent. Drexel claimed that during the voyage to Nassau, the woman had remained in the ship's holder's cargo. She'd been quiet, caused no problems, but at night, the crew began experiencing nightmares. Vivid, terrible nightmares about their worst actions. Drexel said his first mate, a man named Harrison, who'd served with him for 8 years, had woken screaming about a child he'd abandoned in Liverpool 20 years earlier. Another sailor confessed to murder. A third admitted to deserting from the Navy. Drexel himself began dreaming about a fire. Years ago, he'd owned a share in a warehouse in Philadelphia. The warehouse had burned, killing 3 night watchmen. The official investigation ruled it an accident, but Drexel knew the fire had been set deliberately by his business partner to collect insurance money. Drexel had known and said nothing because he'd profited from the insurance settlement too. 3 men died, and he'd taken money stained with their deaths. In his dreams, he saw those men burning night after night. He said he'd wake to find the mute woman standing at the entrance to the hold, just watching him. Never speaking, never moving, just watching with those unchanging eyes. When they reached Nassau, Drexel paid a local planter to take the woman. He left port immediately, not waiting for his scheduled cargo. On the voyage back to Charleston, the nightmares stopped. The crew's mood lifted, but Drexel said he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed inside him, that the woman had somehow made him see himself clearly for the first time, and he couldn't return to comfortable ignorance. Drexel made one more voyage after returning to Charleston. Then he sold his ship and retired at age 43, far younger than most captains. He spent his remaining years, he died in 1868, working with freed people's aid societies and speaking publicly against the slave trade he'd once profited from. Has documented all of this in his private notes. He also noted that he'd received one final communication about the woman in early 1851, a letter from Nassau from the planter who'd purchased her from Drexel. The letter was brief: returning your property on next ship to Charleston, cannot keep her, will accept no payment. Destroy all records of this transaction. The woman arrived back in Charleston in March 1851, exactly 4 years after her first recorded sale. She'd traveled across the low country, been sold 17 times, driven men to confession and ruin, crossed the ocean and returned. And she looked exactly the same, unchanged, unbroken, silent. Hask refused to sell her again. He couldn't. He told his brother he'd rather burn the auction house than be responsible for one more sale, but he also couldn't legally free her. He didn't own her, and the various bills of sale had created such a confused chain of title that it was unclear who did own her. So Hask did something that went against every instinct he'd developed in 20 years of trading human beings. He housed her in a small room behind his auction house office. He gave her a bed, regular meals, and told his clerks she was not to be disturbed. He paid her a small wage from his own pocket for light cleaning work around the office, and he began what would become a 6-month investigation into her origins. The decision wasn't made from compassion, not initially. Has terrified of what might happen if he tried to sell her again. But more than that, he'd become consumed by the mystery. How could one woman create such consistent psychological devastation across so many different men? What was she doing, or what had been done to her that created this effect? He started with the original bill of sale from March 1847. The document identified her as property from a deceased estate in Beaufort County. But when Hess traveled there in late April 1851, the courthouse clerk couldn't find any record of such an estate sale. No probate filings matched the date. No administrator's report listed an enslaved woman of her description. The clerk, an elderly man named Josiah Bentley, who'd worked in the courthouse for 30 years, did remember something unusual from that period. There was a fire, Bentley said, pulling out damaged ledgers from early 1847, took out half our records room. Some estate files were lost completely. Could be your paperwork was among them. But Bentley also mentioned something else. He recalled a planter from near the Ashapu River who'd come through town in February 1847 in a tremendous hurry, filing multiple sales documents all at once. Edmund Lil Bentley said he was selling off property before he died. Unusual thing was he wasn't sick. Seemed healthy enough, but he acted like a man settling his affairs. Died 2 months later anyway. Heart gave out, they said. Has requested access to what remained of Lel's estate records. Most had been claimed by his son Gerald, but the courthouse retained copies of major transactions. Among them, the sale of 11 enslaved people in February 1847, all to different buyers across the low country. No names were recorded, just ages, genders, and brief descriptions. But one entry caught Hask's attention. Female, approximately 27, mute, household trained, sold to J. Merchant, Charleston trader. J. Merchant had been Has competitor. He died in 1849 during a yellow fever outbreak, and his business records had been dispersed among several other traders. Hask spent 3 weeks tracking down those records, finally locating them in the possession of a retired trader named Albert Sims, who lived on Trad Street. Sims was 70 years old and suffering from consumption. He received Hask in a darkened parlor that smelled of camphor and decay. When Hask explained what he was looking for, Sims laughed, a wet rattling sound. "The mute woman," he said. Merchant talked about her before he died, said she was the worst mistake he ever made in business. According to Sims, Merchant had purchased the woman from Lell's estate in February 1847 with the intention of reselling her quickly for profit. She was young, trained, and supposedly loyal, exactly the type that brought premium prices, but Merchant couldn't sell her. Every potential buyer who examined her in the holding pens would make an offer, then return hours later to withdraw it. Some wouldn't explain why. Others would invent reasons, claiming she looked sickly or seemed troublesome or had a defect they'd somehow missed during initial inspection. Merchant kept her for 5 weeks, longer than he'd ever kept any property intended for immediate resale. During that time, according to Sims, Merchant became increasingly agitated. He stopped sleeping properly, started making mistakes in his ledgers, lost 2 major sales because he couldn't concentrate during negotiations. He told me she never did anything wrong. Sims said never caused trouble, never even looked at him directly. But he said he couldn't stand being in the same building with her, said she made him think about every person he'd ever sold, every family he'd separated, every child he'd taken from a mother. He'd been in the business 30 years and never thought twice about it. But with her there, he couldn't stop thinking about it. Finally, in late March 1847, Merchant had sold her to Richard Gillard, the first documented sale in the pattern Hask knew so well. Merchant died 2 years later, but Sims claimed that right before his death, delirious with fever, Merchant had insisted the mute woman was still in his house. He kept saying he could hear her, Sims recalled, said she was standing in the hallway watching him, even though she'd been gone for 2 years by then. This conversation gave Has the final piece he needed to trace the woman's origins back to Edmund Lell. But it also raised new questions. If Lell had owned her before February 1847, why had he suddenly been so desperate to sell her? What had happened to trigger the estate's sale? Has traveled to the Ashapu River region in early June 1851. The Lell plantation was still operating, now under the control of Edmund's son, Gerald. The younger Lell was 34 years old, a thin man with nervous habits, who seemed perpetually uncomfortable in his own skin. When Has arrived at the plantation house and explained the purpose of his visit, Gerald initially refused to discuss anything about his father's property. "That business is closed," Gerald said. "The woman was sold legally. Whatever happened after that is none of our concern." But Hask persisted. He spent 3 days in the area, speaking with neighboring planters, with shopkeepers in the nearest town, with anyone who might remember Edmund Lell in early 1847. Gradually, a picture emerged of a man who'd undergone a dramatic transformation in the months before his death. A neighboring planter named Cyrus Middleton told Haskett that Edmund had come to his house in January 1847, visibly shaken, and had asked to borrow Middleton's Bible. "I'd known Edmund 20 years, Middleton said. "Never known him to be a religious man, but that night he sat in my parlor for 3 hours reading scripture and weeping, wouldn't tell me what was wrong, just kept saying he'd done terrible things and needed to find a way to make peace with God." A merchant in the town of Jacksonboro recalled Edmund Lell coming into his store in late January 1847 and asking detailed questions about the Underground Railroad. He wanted to know if it was real, if people actually escaped north successfully. The merchant said, "Strange questions for a man of his position." I told him I didn't know anything about such matters, which was true enough, but I remember thinking he looked haunted, like a man who'd seen something that broke him. Armed with these accounts, Hask returned to Gerald Lell's plantation. This time he brought a different approach. He told Gerald that he wasn't trying to cause trouble for the family, but that he needed to understand what had happened because the woman was still causing problems for every man who encountered her. "She's in my custody now," Hask said, "and if I'm going to help her or protect others from her effect, I need to know the truth." Something in Hasket's words, or perhaps his evident sincerity, broke through Gerald's resistance. The younger Lal invited Hask into his study, poured them both whiskey, and began to speak. "My father wasn't a kind man," Gerald said, "but he wasn't unusually cruel by the standards of our world. He ran his plantation efficiently. He believed in discipline, but not in excessive violence. He saw the people he enslaved as property, nothing more, nothing less. That was simply how things were." Edmund Lell had owned Rachel, though Gerald didn't know if that was her real name since 1842. He'd purchased her from a trader in Savannah, attracted by her training and her inability to speak. A mute house servant was valuable precisely because she couldn't gossip, couldn't carry tales between the quarters and the big house, couldn't create the kind of drama that speaking servant sometimes caused. For 3 years, Rachel had worked in the household without incident. She was an excellent worker, meticulous, efficient, unobtrusive. But in 1845, Edmund Lal had expanded his operation in a direction that many planters pursued, but few discussed openly. He began systematically breeding enslaved people for sale. He kept records, Gerald said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Like livestock breeding records, he selected women based on physical characteristics, on health, on perceived intelligence. He chose men to father children based on similar criteria. The goal was to produce children who would bring the highest prices at market. Rachel had been among the women selected for this program. She'd borne her first child in late 1845. The child, a girl, was taken from her at 6 months old and sold to a planter in Georgia. Rachel had reportedly shown no emotion during the sale, though the woman who assisted with the birth later told Gerald that Rachel had hummed that same low, vibrating tone continuously for 3 days. After the child was taken, the second child, a boy, was born in early 1847. He was taken at 4 months old and sold to a buyer whose name Gerald claimed not to remember, though Haskett suspected the younger Lell simply didn't want to reveal it. Again, Rachel showed no outward emotion, but the humming returned, lasting nearly a week this time. The third pregnancy had complications. Rachel went into labor early in late January 1847. The child, another boy, lived for only 6 hours. Edmund Lell, according to Gerald, became convinced that Rachel had somehow killed the child deliberately. He thought she'd willed it to die, Gerald said, rather than let him take another baby from her. Whether this belief had any basis in reality was impossible to determine. Infant mortality was common, especially among enslaved women who received inadequate nutrition and medical care during pregnancy. But Edmund Lell was furious. He ordered Rachel whipped 10 lashes a day for 7 days, punishment that Gerald described as excessive even by the standards of the time. On the 7th day, while receiving the final lashes, Rachel had done something that changed everything. Gerald's voice shook as he described it. "I was there," he said. "I watched it happen. She'd taken 69 lashes without making a sound. Not a cry, not a whimper, nothing. My father stood watching, and I think he was beginning to feel uncomfortable, as if he'd gone too far, but didn't know how to stop without appearing weak. On the 70th lash, she turned her head and looked at him, just looked at him, and then she opened her mouth and made that sound. Not a scream, not words, just this low tone that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her chest. It vibrated in your bones. It made your teeth ache. And while she made that sound, she held my father's gaze without blinking, without flinching, without showing anything except this terrible calm certainty. The overseer delivering the lashes stopped. Everyone present stopped. It wasn't a long sound, maybe 5 seconds, but it felt like time stretched. And when she closed her mouth and that sound ended, my father's face was white. He turned and walked back to the house without saying another word. From that day forward, Edmund Lell began to deteriorate. He couldn't sleep. He began seeing Rachel everywhere, in hallways she wasn't in rooms she'd never entered. He started having what Gerald described as fits of conscience, suddenly questioning practices he'd followed for decades without apparent guilt. He tried to explain it to me once, Gerald said. He said that when Rachel made that sound while looking at him, something changed in his perception, as if she'd somehow opened a door in his mind, and all the things he'd carefully avoided thinking about came flooding through. He kept saying he could feel what she felt, that he understood for the first time what it meant to have your children taken, to be powerless, to be treated as less than human. He said it was driving him mad. Edmund Lell had lasted 3 weeks. He'd tried everything to escape the feeling. Prayer, whiskey, work. Nothing helped. Finally, he'd made a desperate decision. He would sell every enslaved person on his plantation. All of them. Get rid of all the evidence of what he'd done. Remove all the reminders of his crimes. He'd started with Rachel. She went first with falsified paperwork showing she'd come from a buffered estate sale. Documentation meant to obscure her connection to the Lell family. Edmund had paid J, merchant, to take her, essentially bribing the trader to remove her from his sight. But selling Rachel hadn't helped. If anything, Edmund's condition worsened. He proceeded to sell 10 more people from his plantation, scattering them across the low country before his family could stop him. Then, in late March 1847, his heart had given out. The doctor said it was natural. Edmund was 53, overweight, under significant stress. But Gerald Lell believed differently. My father died of horror. Gerald said flatly, horror at what he'd done. Horror at being forced to truly see it, to feel it for the first time in his life. That woman, Rachel, she didn't kill him with any curse or poison. She killed him by making him human again, by forcing him to recognize the humanity of the people he treated as animals. Gerald paused, refilling his whiskey glass with shaking hands. I wanted her gone after he died because I was terrified the same thing would happen to me. I'd witnessed everything my father did. I'd helped with the breeding program. I'd recorded sales. I'd calculated profits. If she could do to me what she did to him, make me really see, really feel what we'd done, I don't think I could survive it. Has asked the question that had been burning in his mind since beginning this investigation. What happened to her children, the 2 who lived? Gerald's face hardened. They were sold before any of this happened, both of them. I have no record of where they went. Different buyers, different states probably. They'd be 6 and 4 years old now, 5 and 3 when they were sold. She'll never find them. Even if she searched for the rest of her life, she'd never find them. The paper trail was deliberately obscured, as it usually was with such sales. They're gone. As has absorbed this information, he felt something shift inside himself. For 20 years, he'd facilitated these separations. He'd sold children away from parents, split families, separated husbands from wives. He'd done it efficiently, professionally, without allowing himself to think too deeply about the human cost. But sitting in Gerald Lell's study, hearing the cold calculation in the man's voice, she'll never find them, has suddenly understood what Edmund Lell had experienced. The full weight of his own actions crashed over him like a wave. Every mother who'd begged him to keep her family together. Every child torn screaming from her parents' arms. Every person who'd looked at him with desperate hope that he might show mercy, only to find none. He dismissed all of it as sentimentality, as attachment that property shouldn't feel. But they weren't property. They'd never been property. They were human beings who loved and suffered and grieved, and he'd spent 2 decades inflicting unbearable trauma on them for profit. Has left the Lell plantation that evening, feeling as though he'd aged 20 years in a single day. He returned to Charleston and went directly to his auction house. Rachel was in her small room, mending clothes by candlelight. When he entered, she looked up at him with those same calm, unchanging eyes. He told her everything he'd learned about Edmund Lell, about the breeding program, about her children. He didn't know if she understood. She gave no sign either way, but he felt compelled to speak, to bear witness to what had been done to her. When he finished, she sat down, her mending, and looked at him for a long moment. Then she did something she'd never done in his presence before. She reached out and touched his hand just briefly, just for a moment. Her hand was rough from work, scarred from old injuries, but the touch was gentle, almost forgiving. Has broke down and wept. In the weeks that followed, Hask made a series of decisions that would have shocked anyone who'd known him in his trading days. He couldn't legally free Rachel. The tangled chain of title made that impossible without risking court intervention that might result in her being seized and resold. But he could make her effectively unsellable, and he could try to help her find what she was looking for. He hired a clerk, a young man named Samuel Parrish, who'd recently come to Charleston from Philadelphia and had abolitionist sympathies, to search through sales records from 1845 and 1847. Parrish spent 3 months combing through ledgers, bills of sale, estate records, and auction house documentation, trying to trace the sales of 2 children who matched the ages and description Gerald Lull had provided. It was nearly impossible work. Children that young were rarely recorded with much detail. Ages were approximate, physical descriptions were minimal, names changed or were omitted entirely, but Parrish was determined, and Haskett paid him well for his efforts. They found 17 possible matches, 11 boys who might have been Rachel's second child, 6 girls who could have been the first. The children had been sold across Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. Some had been sold multiple times since. 3 had died. Parrish found death records in estate inventories. The others' fates were unknown. Has presented this information to Rachel in September 1851. He'd compiled it into a document that listed names, locations, and current owners when that information could be determined. He watched as she read through it slowly, her finger tracing each line. When she finished, she looked up at him, and for the first time since he'd known her, he saw something in her expression that might have been hope. She wrote a question on a slate he'd provided. "Can you help?" Askew knew what she was asking. Could he help her find them? Could he help her, a freed woman with forged papers and no legal right to travel unaccompanied through slave states, reach her children and perhaps arrange their freedom? The honest answer was no. It was impossible. Even attempting it would be dangerous for her and potentially illegal for him. The children's current owners had legal title. Rachel had no parental rights. She'd never had them, not under the law. And a black woman traveling alone through the deep South asking questions about enslaved children would attract exactly the kind of attention that could get her killed or re-enslaved. But Hask looked at this woman who'd survived horrors he couldn't fully imagine, who'd been brutalized and broken, and somehow transformed into something that made brutal men confront their own cruelty. And he couldn't refuse her. "I'll try," he said. "I can't promise anything, but I'll try." This decision, more than any other, marked his complete transformation from slave trader to something else entirely. Over the next 4 months, he used his network of contacts across the South, traders he'd worked with, planters he'd sold to, clerks and auctioneers, and estate managers to gather more information about the 17 children Parrish had identified. He presented himself as conducting business, researching potential property for investment, never revealing his true purpose. By January 1852, he'd narrowed the list to 5 strong possibilities. 2 boys and 3 girls who matched the ages, physical descriptions, and sale dates they were searching for. But confirming which, if any, were actually Rachel's children would require something Haskell couldn't provide. Direct contact, personal recognition. some form of confirmation that only Rachel herself could give. The solution came from an unexpected source, the Underground Railroad. Samuel Parrish, the Clark Hask, had connections to Charleston's small but active network of people who helped enslaved individuals escape to freedom. Parrish suggested that this network might be able to help Rachel travel north, while also making contact with people who could investigate the children's whereabouts more safely than a black woman. Traveling alone, it was risky. If Rachel were caught, she'd be re-enslaved. If Hask's involvement were discovered, he'd face criminal charges and social ruin. But both of them had reached a point where those risks seemed acceptable compared to doing nothing. In February 1852, 11 months after Rachel had first come into his custody, Hask helped arrange her departure from Charleston. She left on a moonless night, guided by conductors who would take her north through a series of safe house-seas and hidden routes. Haskett gave her money, more money than he probably should have given his financial situation, and the document Parrish had compiled, now updated with the most recent information about the 5 children who might be hers. Before she left, Rachel did something that surprised everyone present. She wrote a brief message on her slate and showed it to Hask. It said simply, "Thank you for remembering you are human." Then she vanished into the night, beginning a journey whose outcome Hask would never fully know. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Charleston's slave trade intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. Has never received direct word from Rachel after her departure. The nature of the Underground Railroad required secrecy. Correspondence was dangerous, could be intercepted, could compromise everyone involved. But over the following months and years, he occasionally received indirect news through Parrish's network. Rachel had made it safely to Philadelphia by March 1852. From there, she traveled to New York and then to various cities across the North. The information Parrish received suggested she was working with abolitionist organizations, helping other escaped slaves, and continuing her search for her children through whatever channels were available to her. One report received in late 1853 indicated that she might have located her daughter, a girl of approximately 8 years old, enslaved on a plantation in central Georgia, who matched the physical description and whose age aligned perfectly. The report said Rachel had made contact through intermediaries, free black people who could travel more safely in the South, and was working to arrange the child's freedom, either through purchase or escape. Whether this effort succeeded, Hask never learned. The correspondence stopped after that report, and Parrish eventually lost contact with the specific network members who'd been tracking Rachel's movements. What Has did know was what happened in Charleston after Rachel left. He'd called that meeting of slave traders in March 1852, presenting them with the full story he'd pieced together and proposing his solution. Create forged manumission papers backdated to before Edmund Lell's death, supported by all the major traders, making Rachel legally free and eliminating any possibility of her being recaptured and resold. The traders had agreed not from compassion but from self-interest. Rachel had become a problem that threatened their business. Men who'd purchased her had suffered financial losses, psychological breakdowns, and in some cases had abandoned the slave trade entirely. The traders wanted the patent to end, and the cleanest way to end it was to make her permanently unavailable for sale. But something unexpected happened after that meeting. Several of the traders present, including some of Charleston's most successful dealers, began experiencing their own crises of conscience. Within 2 years of Rachel's departure, 3 major auction houses in Charleston closed their doors permanently. The owners gave various public explanations: age, health, changing markets, but privately some admitted they could no longer continue in the trade. One of them, a man named Francis Kershaw, who'd operated one of Charleston's largest slave marts, told Hask in 1854, "I keep thinking about what you told us about that woman and what was done to her, and I realize I've done the same things hundreds of times. Separated mothers from children, bred people like livestock, sold families apart. I used to tell myself it was just business. Business built on that kind of suffering isn't business. It's evil and I can't do it anymore." Has himself closed his auction house in August 1856. He'd been struggling financially. His heart was no longer in the work, and without ruthless focus on profit, his business couldn't compete. But more than that, he simply couldn't bear to continue. He sold the building and used the proceeds to establish a small fund that provided assistance to freed people in Charleston, helping them find employment, housing, and legal support as they built lives in freedom. It wasn't enough. It could never be enough to balance the harm he'd caused over 20 years of trading, but it was something. It was an acknowledgement that the people he'd bought and sold were human beings deserving of dignity and respect, not commodities to be exploited for profit. The plantation owners who'd purchased Rachel fared worse. Of the 17 men who bought her between 1847 and 1851, only 5 still owned their plantations. By 1860, 3 had died, 4 had abandoned their properties, 5 had sold their estates and moved away, often at significant financial loss. The pattern was striking enough that it became noticed, even whispered about in Charleston's commercial circles. People began referring to the Lot 47 curse, though few knew the full story behind the name. Some believed the woman had been genuinely cursed or possessed. Others thought she'd practiced some form of African spiritual tradition that gave her power over her owners. A few suggested she'd been poisoning them somehow, though no evidence of poison was ever found. The truth that Rachel had simply been a woman pushed beyond human endurance, who'd somehow found a way to reflect back at men the cruelty they'd inflicted, was perhaps more disturbing than any supernatural explanation. It suggested that guilt and conscience could be as destructive as any curse if the weight of one's actions became impossible to ignore. Civil war came to Charleston in 1861, and the social order that had made Rachel's suffering possible began its violent collapse. The city was bombarded, burned, occupied by Union forces. The slave trade that had enriched so many Charleston families ended with emancipation. The plantation system crumbled. Many of the men involved in Rachel's story didn't survive to see freedom come to those they'd enslaved. Edmund Law had died in 1847, Thomas Porcher in late 1847, Marcus Brevard in 1857, Cornelius Gage in 1857. William Drexel lived until 1868, but spent his final years working with freedmen's aid societies trying to make some form of amends for his years profiting from the slave trade. Nathaniel Harrington, the scientific planter who'd kept detailed journals, died in 1859, but left provisions in his will freeing everyone he'd held in slavery, a radical act for a South Carolina planter of his era. His journals survived and were eventually donated to a historical society, where they remained largely unread until the 1960s. Richard Gilliard, the first buyer, continued operating his plantation until his death in 1863, but his family scattered after the war. His daughter never married, and the family line ended with them. The Fairweather plantation house burned during Reconstruction under circumstances that were never fully explained. Gerald Lell managed to keep his plantation operating through the war, but lost it during Reconstruction when he couldn't pay taxes on the property. He died in poverty in Charleston in 1879, living in a single rented room above a cobbler's shop. His few remaining possessions included his father's journals, which he'd kept despite repeatedly claiming he wanted nothing to do with that history. Virgil Hask lived until 1868. In his final years, he wrote extensively in private journals, now held by the South Carolina Historical Society, about his transformation from slave trader to abolitionist. He documented his investigation into Rachel's origins, his growing understanding of the horror he'd participated in, and his attempts to make amends. The journals include this entry from December 1867. I received word today through an old contact that a woman matching Rachel's description was seen in Philadelphia in 1865 working with freed people arriving from the South. The contact said she appeared healthy and was accompanied by a young woman of approximately 20 years who called her mother, and I cannot confirm this is the same woman, but I choose to believe it is. I choose to believe she found at least one of her children, that after everything that was done to her, she achieved something that so many others never could. It gives me small comfort in my final months to think that perhaps despite all the cruelty of this world, some measure of justice occasionally prevails. Whether this sighting was actually Rachel or simply someone similar, whether she truly found her daughter or whether had simply wanted to believe she had, these questions remain unanswered. Rachel disappeared from documented history after leaving Charleston in 1852. No definitive records trace her movements after that point, but fragments suggest a life lived in service to others who'd suffered similar trauma. Abolitionists working in the decade before the Civil War occasionally mentioned a mute woman who helped coordinate escapes and assisted newly freed people in building new lives. Frederick Douglass's papers include a brief reference to a woman who couldn't speak, but whose presence at abolitionist meetings seemed to steal the resolve of everyone present. A Philadelphia Quaker's diary from 1858 describes a silent woman of remarkable bearing who worked tirelessly with escaped slaves, seeming to understand their trauma in ways others couldn't. These references might all be Rachel, or they might be other women, other survivors of slavery's brutality, who'd found their own ways to resist and rebuild. The system of slavery created thousands of tragedies like Rachel's. Women who were brutalized, who lost children to sale, who endured unspeakable suffering. Most of their stories were never recorded. Most of their names are lost to history. Rachel's story survives only because her effect on the men who tried to own her was dramatic enough to generate documentation, journals, letters, business records, whispered conversations that were later written down. But for every Rachel whose story was partially preserved, how many others suffered in silence, their stories erased completely from the historical record? The auction house where Rachel was first sold no longer exists. The building burned in 1865, and new construction now occupies that site on Chalma Street. The plantations where she was held have mostly been demolished or converted to other uses. A few survive as tourist attractions. The history's sanitized for visitors who prefer antebellum romance to antebellum reality. But the foundation of Charleston's wealth, the wealth built on trading human beings, remains visible in the city's architecture. The grand houses along the Battery, the historic churches, the commercial buildings, all were constructed with profits from slavery. Every brick represents someone's suffering. Every columned portico stands on a foundation of stolen labor and destroyed families. The city has begun slowly and incompletely to acknowledge this history. Historic markers now mention the slave trade. Museum exhibits discuss plantation life from the perspective of enslaved people. Tour guides sometimes talk about the auction houses that once lined Chalmers Street. But the full horror of what happened, the systematic breeding programs, the deliberate separation of families, the calculated cruelty of the system is still often glossed over or presented in sanitized terms. The psychological torture that accompanied physical brutality is rarely discussed. Fact that people like Rachel were created by this system, people so damaged by their treatment that their mere presence could devastate the men who'd harmed them, is almost never mentioned, perhaps because acknowledging that truth requires acknowledging something uncomfortable about human nature, that we're capable of inflicting terrible suffering when systems and laws tell us it's acceptable. That ordinary people, not monsters, but merchants and planters and respectable citizens, participated in and profited from systematic brutality, and that the weight of that guilt, when finally acknowledged, can be crushing. Rachel's power over the men who bought her wasn't supernatural. It was simply the power of forcing them to see clearly what they'd done, to feel empathy for perhaps the first time, to recognize the humanity of people they'd treated as property. That this experience was devastating to them speaks to how thoroughly they'd suppressed their conscience, how completely they divorced themselves from normal human feeling. In that sense, Rachel's story is a story about moral injury. the damage done to one's own humanity when participating in inhumane systems. Planters and traders who encountered Rachel were forced to confront that damage. Most couldn't bear it. Some were destroyed by it. A few, like Harrington and Hask, were transformed by it. Mystery of Lot 47 isn't really about one woman's supernatural ability to haunt her purchases. It's about the much more disturbing reality of what happens when systematic cruelty meets human conscience, about the psychological toll of participating in systems built on suffering, about what emerges when someone who's been stripped of everything finds a way to strip away the comfortable lies that allow brutality to continue. Rachel survived by becoming a mirror. She reflected back at men what they'd done, forced them to feel what they'd inflicted, made them see themselves clearly. Perhaps for the first time, and most of them couldn't survive that clarity, they collapsed under the weight of their own actions once denial was no longer possible. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was the most powerful form of testimony, a witness who couldn't be silenced by threats or persuaded by bribes, who simply existed as living evidence of what the system had done. Her presence in a house was accusation incarnate. Her calm gaze was judgment that required no words. Whether Rachel found her children, whether she lived to see emancipation, whether she found any measure of peace in her remaining years, these questions may never be answered definitively. But her impact on the men who tried to own her and threw them on Charleston's slave trading community suggests that even within systems designed to crush human dignity, individuals can find ways to resist, ways to fight back, ways to make those who inflict suffering face the reality of what they've done. The broader lesson extends beyond one woman's story. Every social system built on systematic oppression creates its own racials. People who survive not by submission but by transformation, who find power in unexpected places, who refuse to let their oppressors escape the weight of conscience. Sometimes that resistance is open and visible. Sometimes it's quiet and internal, but it's always there, always present, always creating cracks in the foundation of cruelty. Charleston tried to erase Rachel from history. They burned records. They destroyed documentation. They refused to speak her name, but fragments remain. Stories persist. The truth has a way of surviving even determined attempts at suppression. And perhaps that's the final lesson of Lot 47, that truth endures, that suffering witnessed cannot be completely erased, that people who were treated as property were actually human beings with dignity, agency, and power. Power that manifested in ways their oppressors never anticipated and couldn't control. Rachel's story deserves to be remembered, not as ghost story or supernatural tale, but as history, as testimony to what humans endure, what they survive, and what they become when pushed beyond the limits of what should be survivable, as evidence that systems of oppression never fully control the people they oppress, and as reminder that conscience once awakened can be more destructive than any weapon. What do you think of Rachel's story? Do you believe one person could have such a profound psychological impact on so many people? Do you think she found what she was searching for? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, subscribe to Circle of Fear 1 and hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into America's darkest historical corners. Share this video with someone who appreciates stories that challenge us to confront uncomfortable truths. And remember, the histories we choose to forget often contain the lessons we most desperately need to learn.